This is how I made this viral photo using Lightroom Classic. So today we're going to be covering how we can go from this to something like this. I always like to start with cropping the picture, just to see the composition and the direction I want to edit it. Since it's a vertical picture, I'll be focusing on 4:5 because that's the standard for Instagram. This is just to get an idea, so it's not that important, but I prefer, for example, getting my subject in center of the picture. I also recommend when you look at the picture, think of what you like about the picture and what you don't like. So I like the birds here, like the contrast, the bright highlights and the dark shadows. But I do think basically the entire bottom half, it's too dark, quite boring and lacks a bit of detail. Also this car I find really distracting. So I can start by removing it in Lightroom. We just go to our remove tool, click generative AI, zoom in a bit, and then simply select it. Then click apply. Or you can, for example, subtract the mask if you want it more accurate. Oops. Like this. As you can see, it works amazingly. It just does it perfectly. You also have variations, so you just click between these to see different outcomes. So now I will recenter it a bit properly. Something like this. And then I will do what I said before. I really think the shadows are too dark and there's too little detail. So I just increase the shadows so we get more detail. Increasing the contrast since we lost a bit. And then playing around with the exposure. I recommend looking at different parts of the picture when you do this. So you can, for example, look at the top half now, and then you can say I want it like exposed like this. It's still a bit dark. So we just increase the shadows once again. And because I'm increasing the shadows, I'm also losing contrast. So I'll up it once again. I'm also going to add a bit of exposure. Just fine-tuning it. So something like this. Personally, I really like taking down the clarity, especially if you look at the grass here. It's quite sharp, maybe a little bit distracting. If you take down the clarity, become a lot softer. It can become less distracting, focusing on, for example, the top half of the picture. So I recommend a lot of the time to have about -10 to -15. I would not usually increase the texture in a picture like this because there's so much detail and so much grass. But you can see if I zoom in, add more texture, it will again look sharper. But I want the opposite, so I'll just maybe decrease it slightly. Something like this. And then I really like to increase the vibrance a lot and then decrease the saturation. This is because vibrance is a lot softer than saturation. You get a lot of colors, but not too intense. Then I'll look at the white balance. When I took this picture, it was a lot more orange. It was more of a golden hour look. But because your camera basically auto white balance some part of the image, and this time it made a little bit more blue than it was in real life, to try to make it white basically, this area here. So I'm just going to increase it. Now, as you can see in the final picture, there's a lot more contrast and a lot more dramatic, and that is because of, for example, dehaze. If you pull this the opposite way, if you just ignore the bottom half, but you can basically force the clouds to have more contrast. As you can see by its name, dehaze, it will try to remove haze, and in doing so, the clouds especially will become more clear. So I'm just going to increase this, something like this. Keep in mind this will also increase the general contrast of your image. Same with, for example, clarity, will add a lot more contrast to your image. So once again, you will need to adjust. I also think it's too dark now once again. Then I can again decrease the exposure. As you can see, when I decrease the exposure, I'm losing a lot of the highlights. So I will expose the general sky where I want, and then increase the highlights. When there's peaking in your image like this, I just recommend actually, instead of decreasing it, just increasing it, because then you will get a real nice soft bloom in your image. And this bloom we can use to motivate, for example, some God rays. Now I'm just going to test a little bit with the white balance once again. Now we have our basic settings out of the way, and we have a general look for our image. Then we go to tone curve. I'm just going to do a simple S curve. I want to increase the blacks a bit since I don't want it to be too dark. Decreasing the shadows and getting more contrast. Slightly increase the highlights. And test with the mid-dots. Take something like this, and then we decrease the exposure once again. Before you even go to different color mixes, I just recommend adding layers to your image by adding masks. I always like adding linear masks, and it's simple, just click and drag. The red part is where the mask itself is, and this part is the fade, so the bigger fade, the more softer it will be in the image. So I can add basically a manual vignette like this. I'm just going to simply decrease exposure, and as you can see, it's really soft, so you don't really notice it. But if I do something like this, it's a lot more noticeable. You see it just like a line, so you need to fade the mask. I'm going to create a linear mask up here and add slightly more exposure. This is basically just to motivate the light a bit more and make the picture more dynamic. I want to increase vibrance a bit and decrease saturation. Now I'm going to add the God rays I did in the picture by adding a radial filter. As you can see, we have some small versions of the God rays here. So I'm simply going to enhance them by adding more exposure. So I'm simply going to add exposure, add more contrast, not only to make it appear more, but also make the birds pop more in the background. Increasing the highlights, and you see we get a real nice ray effect. Test a bit with the whites, take down the blacks to increase the contrast of the birds. Once again, adding highlights and adding exposure. I also recommend actually adding minus the haze, to just add fog basically to your picture. As you can see, add a little bit like that, and minus clarity. So now if you look before and after, this is a really quick way to add a God ray that works really well if you have a strong highlight point like this. So if you now take a look at the original finished photo, you see I still have a lot more contrast in the sky. One way to adjust this is to select the sky in Lightroom. If you see that your mask is not correct, you can simply select the brush and then paint it over. Like this. Just decreasing the flow and opacity basically to make the transition more soft. And click option to remove the mask again. Then I'm going to add more contrast. Then test a bit more with the vibrance. Like that. And then Test a bit more the highlights. A little bit of white balance again to get the right color. Now, once we basically have our base part of the image, then I recommend going to the colors. So the main thing will be the green and orange. And I'm actually going to increase the luminance. This will make the greens brighter and add more detail. The hue of the green to see what fits best. I think a bit more like this. And make it quite more dynamic, because if you move it like this, everything will become orange and become less dynamic and quite boring. And test the saturation and try to make it interesting without overpowering the image. So something like this is a nice balance compared to the orange. Now the yellows and orange, we'll test saturation. I think slightly more will help, and then test with the luminance. Slightly more again, something like this, and then once again slightly adjust the basics. See, the brush is very visible, so I can just clear it like this. And now we have a really balanced picture. We have different colors, and we have created a lot of depth in the picture with using masks. So this is before masks, and this is after. Still think we can create more depth, for example by making it even darker at the bottom here, and adding another radial gradient, the origin of the light. Make it pop even more, like this. Then maybe add a little bit more contrast. Test a bit with the dehaze. Maybe crop it a little bit closer. Something like this. I'm also going to adjust the sky a little bit, the curves. If you hold shift, you will only move the curve up and down. It's really useful. And same thing here, holding shift. And then you can really adjust how you want it. So there we have it. We have our final picture. This is the before, this is the after. We have focused on making the picture more dynamic by adding masks, like this. And then bringing out the detail by increasing the shadows, because they were really dark. Removing the car, making the sky more dramatic by adding God rays, adding contrast. Instead of just being a blown out sky, it now has a lot of contrast, a lot of detail, and it just makes it more interesting. Thank you guys for watching the tutorial. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you guys so much for all the incredible support lately. Truly appreciate all the nice comments and feedback. If you want to see more photos, be sure to follow me on my TikTok and Instagram.